May 31st, 1940, 447. The Perimeter Canal east of Dunkirk. A British captain from the 2nd Battalion, Royal Norfolk Regiment, pressed his back against cold brick. Canal water lapped below. Above him, the sky pulsed orange. Dunkirk burned. Behind him, 3 miles distant, boats, hundreds of them, crawled toward England. He checked his ammunition. 12 rounds? The soldier beside him asked the question they'd all been thinking. "Sir, when do we pull back?" The captain didn't answer immediately, for he knew something this private did not. Something that would remain classified for 30 years. He knew there was no boat waiting for them, no final evacuation, no dramatic last-minute rescue. He turned to face his men. 20 faces, boys, most of them. "We hold until 2300 hours, then we surrender." Silence. Not "we fall back." Not "we withdraw to secondary positions." Surrender. One private document would later record that men began to cry. Not from fear, from understanding. They were never meant to leave. This is the story of 40,000 British soldiers whose names you don't know, whose sacrifice enabled the miracle of Dunkirk, who held a perimeter they knew would become their prison so that 338,000 others could reach England. But here's what makes this story different from every book, every film, every documentary you've seen about Dunkirk. We're not going to tell it from the boats. We're not going to tell it from Churchill's war room. We are going to tell it from the German perspective, from the soldiers who broke through that final perimeter and found something they didn't expect. As Janelle Lunant, Hinrich von Lutwitz, would later write in his combat report. We anticipated broken men awaiting capture. We found defensive positions that cost us casualties until the final hour. This wasn't a retreat that succeeded. This was a retreat that required 40,000 men to willingly become prisoners of war, to choose capture, to sacrifice 5 years of their lives, and for thousands, all of their remaining years, so that Britain could continue fighting. And the question nobody asks, the question that haunts every historical account: how do you order 40,000 men to stay behind and die, or worse, to wait for capture while they watch their comrades sail to safety? The answer is in the silence between German rifle reports, in the arithmetic of sacrifice, in what those German soldiers found when they finally overran those positions. If you think Dunkirk was about boats, you've been watching the wrong part of the battle. Let's establish something uncomfortable. By May 29, 1940, British High Command knew the mathematics perfectly. The evacuation capacity, approximately 30,000 men per day under ideal conditions. The total BEF force requiring extraction, 368,000 men. The German advance rate, 12 kilometers per day. The perimeter circumference that needed defense, 48 kilometers. Do the math. It doesn't work. Not everyone goes home. So someone somewhere, in a command post, probably thick with cigarette smoke and desperation, made the calculation that would define the operation. They needed to maintain a defensive perimeter long enough to evacuate the maximum number. That perimeter required approximately 3,500 to 40,000 men minimum to hold against German assault. Those men would become arithmetic variables in an equation where the solution was Britain survives. But who? How do you choose? The British answer was grimly logical. Not the youngest, not the rawest recruits, not the rear echelon troops who'd never fired in combat. The most experienced, the best trained, the units with the most combat veterans. Why? Because broken men can't hold a perimeter. Green troops panic under sustained assault. You needed men who'd been bloodied, who understood fire discipline, who could make 40 rounds last 4 hours. who could watch boats leave without breaking ranks. The 2nd and 5th Divisions, the 50th Division, elements of the 3rd, 4th, and 42nd Divisions, the 1st French Army's northern units. These weren't stragglers. These were some of the best trained formations in the BEF. They were told simply, "You are the rear guard." Not, "You might be," not, "We'll try to get you out," just, "You are staying." Or Friedrich Wilhelm von Chapuis, commanding the 2nd Panzer Division's Reconnaissance Battalion, recorded his surprise in a May 31st dispatch. Resistance quality remains undiminished. These are not defeated troops. They fight with coordination, suggesting command structure intact. Because it was intact, organized, following orders to defend a perimeter they knew would collapse. But not yet. Not until enough boats had crossed. The British established a system, a roster. Ships departed Dunkirk harbor in designated waves. Each wave corresponded to specific units released from perimeter duty. Your unit's name on the roster meant you had permission to withdraw toward the beaches. If your unit wasn't on the roster, you stayed in position. The 2nd Royal Norfolk Regiment received their roster update on May 30th. They were scheduled for evacuation wave 47. There were only 32 waves planned. The officer who received this information understood immediately. This was how the British Army told you that you weren't leaving, bureaucratically, with numbers that didn't add up. By June 1st, the perimeter had contracted to less than 10 kilometers around Dunkirk proper. The density of troops per meter increased, which meant one thing. When the position finally collapsed, the Germans would capture everyone simultaneously. There would be no fighting retreat, no gradual withdrawal, just overrun. A German infantry lieutenant, Walter Schaefer-Kennett, later wrote about reaching British positions on June 4th. "We expected desperate chaos, found trenches maintained to manual standards, ammunition arranged by type. One position had tea brewing. Tea brewing while waiting for capture. This is what discipline looks like when you've been told you're not going home. But why? Why maintain standards when you know you're about to spend 5 years in a POW camp if you survive at all? Because the longer you hold properly, the more boats cross. Every hour of organized resistance equals approximately 1,500 more men reaching England. Every magazine of ammunition fired with discipline. Every coordinated withdrawal to secondary positions. Every calculated delay equals lives saved. Not your life. Their lives. The rear guard understood the math. They were trading their freedom measured in years for others' freedom measured in hours. 40,000 men, 5 years average captivity. That's 200,000 years of human life collectively exchanged for 1 week of evacuation, and they held the line. May 29, 1940. German 4th Army Headquarters. General Urga von Klug receives reconnaissance reports from the Dunkirk perimeter. His staff officers expect the reports to confirm what seems obvious. The British are in disarray, abandoning equipment, racing for boats. The perimeter should collapse within 24 hours. The reports say something different. British defensive positions are improving. Trenches that were hasty on May 28th have been reinforced by May 29th. Fields of fire have been cleared methodically. Artillery concentration suggests coordination between units, not isolated pockets of resistance. Von Klug makes a note in his command diary. The enemy fights with unexpected determination. Progress is measured in hundreds of meters, not kilometers. The Germans had faced the BEF during the retreat from Belgium. They'd seen British units break under Stuka attacks, abandon positions when flanked, surrender when surrounded. They expected more of the same, only worse. because now the British were literally backed against the sea. What they found instead was something closer to a prepared defense than a desperate last stand. Fieldman Hans von Luck, commanding a reconnaissance unit approaching the perimeter, described it in his post-war memoir. "We expected refugees with weapons. We engaged soldiers conducting a planned defense. The difference cost us considerably." The British had advantages the Germans didn't anticipate. First, interior lines. Defending a contracting perimeter meant British units could reposition quickly, reinforcing threatened sectors while maintaining density. Second, pre-positioned supplies. The BEF had been falling back on its own supply dumps. Ammunition wasn't scarce, it was abundant. Third, observation. Every British position could see Dunkirk harbor. They watched the boats. They knew exactly what they were buying with their blood. But the biggest advantage, they'd already accepted their fate. A soldier who expects to escape fights differently than a soldier who's already made peace with capture. The first conserves ammunition, preserves his life, looks for opportunities to withdraw. The second expends everything, takes risks, stays in position when staying means death. The Germans were fighting men who'd been told they weren't leaving. That changes the calculation. Lieutenant Otto Henel, 8th Panzer Division, wrote in a letter home dated June 2nd, "The English do not fight like men seeking escape. They fight like men protecting something precious behind them." They were 338,000 somethings, each one boarding a boat while the rear guard burned through ammunition. The German assault pattern was consistent. Artillery preparation, infantry advance, discover the British position is still occupied. Call for artillery again, repeat. On average, each strongpoint required 3 separate assaults to neutralize. At that rate, breaking through 48 kilometers of perimeter would take weeks. The British knew this. Their defense wasn't designed to win. It was designed to cost time. Every German artillery barrage that had to be called in, every infantry assault that had to be reorganized, every casualty that had to be evacuated, all of it consumed minutes. And minutes meant boats. By June 1st, German commanders began reporting something unusual. British positions were surrendering tactically. Not when overrun, but when withdrawal to secondary positions was no longer possible. Units would fight until encircled, then negotiate surrender, but only after inflicting maximum delay. August Wilhelm von Rittgen, observing the fighting on June 2nd, noted, "They surrender when further resistance serves no purpose, not before. This is not panic. This is calculation." The calculation was simple. Hold until you can't hold. Then surrender immediately to avoid pointless casualties. Don't waste lives. The tactical benefit is exhausted. It was brutally efficient, and it preserved lives for 5 years of captivity instead of throwing them away in suicidal last stands. But it required something extraordinary. The discipline to recognize when you've accomplished your mission, buying time, and the courage to raise your hands while you're still combat effective. One German officer interviewing captured British soldiers on June 4th asked why they hadn't attempted to break out toward Dunkirk in the final hours. The British sergeant reportedly answered, "We were ordered to hold. We held. Orders didn't include breaking out." The German officer found this incomprehensible. His report noted, "British discipline remains intact, despite awareness of their strategic situation. This cannot be explained by coercion. They believe in their purpose." They did, because every hour they held, the numbers changed. 338,000 escaped, became 338,026. Then 338,000 338,051, then 338,079. Each number was a name. A soldier who'd board a boat while his comrades fixed bayonets behind the perimeter. Who'd survive the war? Who'd return home? Who'd father children who exist? Because 40,000 men measured their lives in hourly increments and decided the math was acceptable. The Germans expected a rout. They found a sacrifice, and it cost them something they didn't anticipate. Respect. 3 battles you've never heard of. Let's descend from strategy to mud, from grand mathematics to the specific horror of 3 defensive actions that epitomize the Dunkirk rearguard. 3 battles with no names, no memorials, no plaques, just map coordinates and casualty reports. Position 1, Canal Line, Bourbourg. May 30th. The 2nd Battalion, the Gloucester Regiment, holds 800 meters of canal bank northeast of Dunkirk. 2 companies, approximately 240 men. Their orders: hold until 1800 hours, then withdraw to secondary positions. At 9:15, German artillery begins ranging. By 9:40, the barrage is systematic, walking up and down the canal line. The British stay in their trenches because there's nowhere else to go. You don't retreat from a barrage when you're the last line. At 10:30, the artillery ceases, and infantry from the 18th Infantry Division begins crossing. The Gloucesters wait. This is critical. Green troops fire too early, waste ammunition on targets beyond effective range. These men have been trained in the British doctrine of fire discipline. Wait until 200 meters. Wait until you can see faces. Wait until every round counts. At 175 meters, the British line opens fire. The German assault staggers, not stops, staggers. Sergeants shout, "Reforming." The assault continues because German infantry doctrine emphasizes momentum. Keep moving, keep pushing, accept casualties, breakthrough. But the British aren't breaking. They're killing efficiently. Measured bursts, 3 rounds. 50 feet from the position, 3 rounds again, making every magazine last. The assault reaches the canal bank. Hand grenades arc across water. British positions take casualties. Men folding silently, others screaming, but the line holds because the density is sufficient. 1 man falls, another shifts to cover his sector. By 11:45, the German assault has stalled. They've reached the canal, but can't establish a crossing under British fire. The German company commander calls for more artillery. At 12:10, the barrage resumes. This continues. Assault, repulse, artillery, assault, until 17:30. When the Gloucesters finally receive permission to withdraw, they've held for 8.5 hours. Cost: 89 men killed or wounded. German casualties in that sector, estimated 200 plus. A German soldier from that assault, interviewed decades later, remembered, "We took that canal, but the English made us buy it in blood, meter by meter." Those 8.5 hours meant approximately 12,750 more men evacuated from Dunkirk. Position 2, Newport Crossroads, June 1st. The 1st Battalion, East Lancashire Regiment, defends a road junction east of Newport. This isn't a fortified position. It's a hastily dug line of foxholes and 1 disabled British Matilda tank being used as a pillbox. Their mission: prevent German mechanized units from using this junction to flank the main perimeter. Expected duration: as long as possible. At 600 hours, German reconnaissance probes the position. The East Lancashires don't fire. They're conserving ammunition and not revealing positions for mere reconnaissance. At 7:45, a full German assault. 3 companies with armored car support. The British wait until the armored cars are committed to the road. There's no room to maneuver off-road in this waterlogged terrain. Then they engage. The lead armored car takes multiple hits. It doesn't brew up. These are rifle rounds. Maybe one anti-tank rifle, but it stops. The second car tries to reverse, collides with the third. Now there's a jam. German infantry deploys, begins suppressing British positions, but the terrain favors defense. Every approach is across open ground with zero cover. The British have interlocking fields of fire from that disabled Matilda and the Foxhole line. The assault develops slowly. Germans advance, take cover, suppress, advance again. This is doctrine. This is how you reduce a position methodically. By 1100 hours, they've advanced 200 meters. By 1400 hours, they've advanced another 100 meters. At 1530, the British receive orders to withdraw. But here's the problem. Withdrawal requires covering fire, and covering fire requires someone to stay behind while others move. The Matilda crew volunteers. They're in a disabled tank. They can't withdraw anyway. 4 men. They'll maintain fire until overrun. The Foxhole line withdraws in bounds. Half move while half cover. It's textbook. It's what they've drilled for years, and it works until it doesn't. At 16:15, German forces overrun the junction. The Matilda crew surrenders when their ammunition is exhausted. The infantry companies reach secondary positions with 60% strength. A German action report noted, "Junction captured at 16:15 hours. Resistance determined. Our advance delayed 7 hours by approximately 150 enemy combatants." 7 hours. That's 10,500 more evacuations. Position 3, La Redoute, June 3rd. This is the end. The perimeter has contracted to just Dunkirk itself. But there's one last strong point on the beach at La Panne. A collection of destroyed vehicles, beach obstacles, and sand bunkers held by remnants of 3 different British battalions, maybe 300 men total. No officers above the rank of captain. They've been pulled together from stragglers and isolated units. They receive no orders because there's no coherent command structure left. They just know, hold the beach until you can't. At dawn, German forces approach from inland. The fighting is biblical in its simplicity. The British are dug into sand with the sea at their backs. There's no withdrawal, no secondary position. This is mathematics at its purest. How long can 300 men delay German forces? The answer, 11 hours. They fight with whatever they have. Rifles low on ammunition, a single Bren gun, pistols. Eventually, bayonets and entrenching tools. Because when you've accepted that you're not leaving, the calculation becomes, how many more boats can cross in the time we have left? A German unit officer who participated in the final assault wrote, "We wondered why they did not surrender earlier. They had no hope of escape. But they fought until we were in their positions because in their positions meant the fight was over. Until then, it meant time, minutes, seconds, each one precious." When the position finally collapsed at 17:30 hours, German soldiers found British dead still gripping weapons, found wounded who'd continued firing until physically unable, found men who'd fought with broken bones, shrapnel wounds, burns, and they found something else. Discarded letters, notes written to families, knowing they'd never be sent. Instructions to tell mother I held. Requests to remember we chose this. The last boat left Dunkirk at 3:40 on June 4th. The La Redoute position fell 9 hours before that. which means those 300 men bought time for approximately 13,500 final evacuations. 300 men for 13,500. The mathematics of sacrifice. German commanders consolidating a victory. The perimeter collapsed. Faced an unexpected problem. What to do with 40,000 prisoners who'd fought so effectively that they'd earned something approaching respect. General Major Walter Model wrote in his division report, "British prisoners conducted themselves with military bearing. They had fulfilled their mission with honor." For a German officer in 1940 to write that about a defeated enemy, that tells you something about what they'd witnessed. Here's the question that haunts this story. What goes through a man's mind when he watches boats leave without him? Because that's what happened daily, hourly. The men holding the perimeter could see Dunkirk. They could see the harbor. They could count the boats. They could watch the evacuation they were defending, and they could watch those boats leave. Without them. There's a specific kind of psychological torture in that. It's not the torture of surprise capture, where one moment you're fighting and the next you're surrounded. It's not the quick violence of battle where adrenaline numbs thought. It's the slow realization, stretched across days, that you're protecting an escape you're not part of. British psychiatrists would study this after the war, interview the survivors, analyze the mental health impacts. They uncovered something unanticipated. The rearguard exhibited lower incidences of psychological distress compared to the soldiers who were successfully evacuated. The reason? They had attained a state of conviction. Those soldiers who were evacuated prematurely were burdened by survivors' remorse, questioning why they were spared while others were not. Conversely, the soldiers evacuated at an intermediate stage grappled with perpetual doubt. Would they survive? Should they press on towards the vessels? Were they abandoning their comrades? The rearguard, however, was free from such internal turmoil. Their directives were unambiguous, their objective clearly defined. They were to remain until the very end, at which point they would surrender. There was no room for interpretation, no pangs of guilt for being alive, no ethical quandaries. Their sole responsibility was to hold the defensive perimeter until the appointed time, and then to accept the unavoidable outcome. A British chaplain, who was taken prisoner alongside the rearguard, chronicled his observations in his personal journal. The men exhibit a more cheerful disposition than I had anticipated. They are aware that they have fulfilled their obligations. This certainty served as a bulwark against any potential feelings of regret. However, this resilience was not universal. A portion of the soldiers succumbed to the immense pressure. Reports from the front lines detailed instances of soldiers attempting to flee towards the beaches, abandoning their posts, and proving incapable of maintaining the necessary psychological fortitude. The critical differentiator between those who endured and those who faltered was the strength of their unit cohesion. The British military had meticulously instilled within these men one paramount principle: regimental identity. They were not merely individual soldiers. They were members of the Royal Norfolk Regiment, men of the Gloucestershire Regiment, inheritors of a legacy stretching back through centuries. Their regiment possessed a history of valorous engagements, upheld noble standards, and crucially, did not falter simply because the situation seemed insurmountable and their fellow soldiers were bearing witness. Private Frederick Carter of the 2nd Royal Norfolks, captured at Dunkirk, later articulated this sentiment. "You couldn't let the lads down, not after training together, sharing meals together, grumbling about the rations together. If they were staying, then so was I." This encapsulates the core psychology. It is not heroic valor in the cinematic sense, nor is it individual bravery conquering fear. It is an intrinsic inability to let down the men fighting alongside you. It is a social bond so profoundly powerful that enduring 5 years of captivity seems a more palatable prospect than being the one who fled. German interrogators took note of this phenomenon. Intelligence reports compiled in June of 1940 consistently referenced British prisoners of war who, when separated from their units, expressed anxiety not for their own welfare, but for the potential damage to their regiment's historical reputation. One British sergeant, when questioned by a German intelligence officer about his failure to attempt an escape, reportedly stated, "Sir, my orders were to hold." The soldiers of the 2nd Norfolks did not disregard orders, particularly not in the presence of their adversaries. The Germans found this mindset utterly bewildering. Their military doctrine emphasized aggressive action, tactical initiative, and the exploitation of opportunities. The notion of rigidly adhering to orders that would inevitably lead to capture struck them as irrational, yet it proved remarkably effective. This ingrained mindset, this regimental identity that rendered flight unthinkable, was the very force that enabled 40,000 men to observe the departure of rescue vessels while remaining steadfast in their defensive positions. A letter preserved within the British military archives, penned by Lieutenant Colonel James Foster, who was captured at Dunkirk, addressed to his wife from prisoner of war camp 96 APW, attempts to explain his inaction. "My dearest, you must grasp the situation. We were the bulwark. If that bulwark had crumbled prematurely, the entire structure would have collapsed. I was merely a component of that bulwark. Stones do not unilaterally decide to transform into something else. They remain stones until the edifice no longer requires them. We were indispensable until the 4th of June. We therefore remained stones." This was his conceptualization of the situation, not as an act of sacrifice nor as an instance of heroism, but as the fulfillment of a structural role. And here lies an unsettling truth. The British command was acutely aware of this psychological dynamic. They understood that regimental identity, unit cohesion, and unwavering discipline could be leveraged as potent instruments, employed to persuade soldiers to accept capture even when escape remained a theoretical possibility. Was this manipulation, or was it the ultimate manifestation of voluntary self-abnegation, of men choosing to embody the bulwark because its existence was critical? The Germans never definitively resolved this question. Throughout the occupation of France and the subsequent years spent in prisoner of war camps, German officers repeatedly queried their British captives. "Why did you not attempt to escape? Why did you surrender when you had the opportunity to fight your way to the rescue boats?" The consistent reply was invariably some variation of, "Because we were ordered to hold, and we held." Major General Erwin RML, who commanded the 7th Panzer Division during the French campaign, noted in a personal correspondence, "The properly led British soldier displays a tenacity that defies rational assessment. They defended Dunkirk with the full knowledge that defeat was inevitable. This speaks to cultural influences that we would be remiss to underestimate." Cultural influences. He was attempting to comprehend the rationale behind 40,000 men remaining behind. The answer lies in the fact that their identities as British soldiers, as members of specific regiments with unique historical narratives, rendered any alternative course of action psychologically untenable. One may debate the nobility or the tragedy of their actions, whether British command exploited their psychological makeup or entrusted them with an insurmountable task. However, the outcome itself is beyond dispute. 338,000 men reached England because 40,000 chose to remain. And those 40,000 held their ground because their sense of duty, their unwavering unit cohesion, and their profound regimental pride superseded their innate drive for self-preservation. This transcends mere heroism. It is something more profound and perhaps more chilling. It is an identity so deeply entrenched that it overrides basic biological imperatives. The final vessel departs from Dunkirk harbor at 3:40 hours on June 4, 1940. It is a destroyer, HMS Shikari, laden far beyond its safe capacity. Men cling to every available surface, some submerged in water. It is of little consequence. They are leaving. On the perimeter, the soldiers who remain watch the receding wake. There is no final radio transmission authorizing their surrender, no dramatic last communication. The rearguard understands that the evacuation is complete because they can visually confirm its completion. No more vessels are visible in the harbor. No more plumes of smoke rise from ship funnels, only an unnerving silence. And the German forces, who have been steadily tightening the cordon for days, also sense this shift. The pattern of resistance changes. British positions are no longer strategically withdrawing to secondary defensive lines. Instead, they are fighting with unyielding resolve until they are overwhelmed, at which point they surrender, having exhausted all possibilities for withdrawal. Hermann Balck, commanding an infantry regiment, described the final offensive in his combat log. Resistance crumbled segment by segment, not due to panic, but from an exhaustion of purpose. They had purchased their time, and they had nothing left with which to continue purchasing it. The surrenders occur piecemeal. One position raises a white flag, typically a torn undergarment or a bedsheet. German troops advance with caution. They have learned that these British soldiers will engage them with lethal force until the precise moment they decide to cease fighting. At that juncture, they will neatly stack their weaponry, form ranks, and await processing. By 800 hours on June 4th, the defensive perimeter has entirely disintegrated. British and French prisoners stream towards German collection points. The sheer numbers are staggering. By mid-morning, German forces have taken approximately 35,000 British and 40,000 French troops into custody. However, a peculiar observation emerges. The prisoners do not present as the disorganized rabble of defeated men that the Germans had anticipated. They maintain their unit formations. Sergeants are diligently keeping roll calls. Officers are attempting to account for all their men. One German processing officer reported that British prisoners insisted on being catalogued not merely by name and rank, but by their specific regiment and battalion. Even in the face of utter defeat, their sense of identity remained paramount. The Germans established temporary prisoner of war camps in the vicinity of Dunkirk, prior to their transportation to more permanent facilities in Germany. These camps were characterized by utter chaos, tens of thousands of men, minimal sustenance, and a complete lack of sanitary infrastructure. Despite these dire conditions, the British prisoners self-organized, forming camp committees, implementing rationing systems, and preserving their military structure, even while in captivity. Lieutenant Wolfgang Kleine, assigned to prisoner of war processing, wrote in a letter dated June 6th, "The British soldiers exhibit a discipline bordering on the incomprehensible. They have been defeated and captured, yet they maintain their bearing as if merely awaiting new orders." Those new orders, however, would not arrive for 5 years. Consider the cold arithmetic of what transpired subsequently. Of the approximately 35,000 British soldiers captured at Dunkirk, roughly 29,000 would survive the prisoner of war camps to return to their homeland after the war concluded. 6,000 perished due to disease, malnutrition, workplace accidents, forced labor, Allied bombings of the camps, or execution for escape attempts. This represents a 17% mortality rate over a 5-year period. Compare this to the mortality rate of Soviet prisoners in German camps, which stood at 57%, or German prisoners in Soviet camps, with a 35% fatality rate. The British, by comparison, fared relatively well. This relative success can be attributed to the protections afforded by the Geneva Conventions. In 1940, the Germans still largely adhered to international law concerning Western European prisoners. However, relatively well does not equate to comfort. It meant subsisting on 1,200 calories per day. It entailed years of debilitating dysentery, typhus, and tuberculosis. It meant witnessing comrades succumb to preventable illnesses. It involved forced labor in coal mines, factories, and farms. Work that, while in violation of the Geneva Conventions, was nonetheless carried out. Sergeant William Patterson of the 2nd Gloucesters, captured on June 4th, meticulously maintained an illicit diary throughout his period of captivity. An entry from August of 1941 reads, "Another lad from the battalion died today. Dysentery, an ailment that could have been treated in any proper hospital. He simply faded away. We buried him with what little dignity we could muster. He held fast at Dunkirk so that others might escape. He deserved a better fate than this. They all deserved better than that." Yet, herein lies the critical point regarding the Dunkirk rearguard. They understood, at the moment they accepted their orders to remain behind, that captivity would likely spell death for some among them. They were aware that 5 years in a prisoner of war camp could shatter one physically and mentally. They comprehended that they were trading their freedom, and potentially their lives, for the escape of others. And they calculated that this exchange was justifiable. This is the aspect that proves challenging for us to fully grasp. We tend to conceptualize sacrifice in terms of instantaneous decisions. The grenade one throws oneself upon, the charge one leads, moments of extraordinary bravery compressed into mere seconds. The Dunkirk rearguard, however, engaged in sacrifice at a decelerated pace, unfolding over hours, then days, and ultimately years. They had ample time for deliberation. They had opportunities to reconsider their commitment. They could have chosen to flee towards the beaches. Instead, they remained. And when the ordeal finally concluded, and the Germans had processed and organized them for transport to Germany, an event occurred that profoundly impressed the German soldiers. The British prisoners began to sing, not songs of defiance or patriotic anthems, but "It's a Long Way to Tipperary." It was a marching song, a song imbued with the hope of returning home, because they genuinely believed they would, that they would witness the war's conclusion and be able to recount how they had held the line. Hauptmann Hans von Witzlager, who was escorting prisoners to the railway station, reported, "The enemy prisoners sang while marching to the trains. This display of morale, in the face of such defeat, attests to the caliber of the opponent we faced. They were not defeated. They had accomplished their objective. To have defeated them would have meant breaching the defensive perimeter before the evacuation was complete. The Germans failed in this endeavor. The British forces persevered until there was nothing left to defend. Their mission was accomplished, albeit at the cost of everything. The ultimate irony: those 338,000 men who escaped Dunkirk, saved by the sacrifice of the rearguard, would later form the backbone of the British forces that executed the Normandy landings. The 50th Division, which had held the line at Dunkirk, was reconstituted with replacements and landed on Gold Beach. The 3rd Division disembarked at Sword Beach. The very men who had remained behind at Dunkirk directly facilitated D-Day, not merely in a strategic capacity by preserving the British Expeditionary Force for future operations, but in a tangible, literal sense. The divisions that had manned the perimeter were the same divisions that would return to French soil 4 years later. However, they would return without the 40,000 who had so valiantly saved them. Now let us confront a difficult question. Why is it that you are unaware of their names? The story of Dunkirk is widely known. Everyone is familiar with Dunkirk, the miraculous evacuation, the armada of civilian vessels. It has been immortalized in films, books, and documentaries. It stands as one of the most prominent events of the Second World War. Yet, when was the last time you heard any mention of the 40,000 who remained behind? This omission is not accidental. It is a deliberate choice. A narrative decision made by historians, filmmakers, politicians, and indeed, by everyone who has recounted the Dunkirk saga since 1940. The reason for this lies in the inherent complexity of the rearguard's story. The prevailing narrative of the Dunkirk spirit focuses on defiance in the face of defeat, on snatching victory from the jaws of catastrophe. It highlights British resilience and the extraordinary efforts of ordinary civilians who braved perilous waters to rescue their army. This narrative is undeniably inspirational and cinematically compelling, serving to bolster British morale in 1940, when that morale was the sole factor sustaining Britain's continued resistance. The rearguard story, however, is one of sacrifice so bleak it borders on the unbearable. It is the narrative of 40,000 men ordered to become prisoners so that others might escape. It is the chronicle of 5 years spent in prisoner of war camps and the 6,000 who perished within them. It is an arithmetic that treats human lives as mere variables in a grand equation. This is not inspirational. It is profoundly tragic. And in June of 1940, Britain required inspiration, not tragedy. Consequently, Winston Churchill's renowned speech emphasized the evacuation, proclaiming, "We shall fight on the beaches. We shall fight on the landing grounds." He alluded to the rescued troops, characterizing the event as a deliverance. He meticulously constructed the mythos of the Dunkirk spirit that would sustain Britain throughout the Blitz. He made no mention of the fact that this deliverance came at the cost of 40,000 deliverers. This omission was not born of indifference, but of necessity. To acknowledge it would have undermined the very narrative Britain desperately needed to survive. One cannot inform a nation facing existential peril that its army was saved by the deliberate sacrifice of a division of its finest troops. Such a revelation would not build morale. It would incite despair. Therefore, the rearguard was subtly excised from the popular historical account. While they were acknowledged in military histories and their sacrifices noted in regimental records, they did not occupy a central position in the overarching narrative. Furthermore, in the aftermath of the war, when these soldiers returned home, the vast majority chose not to speak of their experiences. This pattern is consistently observed in veteran accounts. Those who survived the prisoner of war camps rarely discussed their captivity, and when they did not frame it as an act of sacrifice. Instead, they characterized it as misfortune, as being in the wrong place at the wrong time, as simply being on the perimeter when the opportunity for escape vanished. They tended to downplay their own agency in the situation. Perhaps this was because acknowledging that they had actively chosen captivity, that they had remained while others fled, necessitated confronting aspects of themselves they preferred not to examine. Or perhaps it was because they simply did not perceive their actions as heroic, but merely as their duty. Private Frederick Carter, whom we mentioned earlier, was interviewed in 1985 as part of an oral history project. When asked why he had never recounted his experiences at Dunkirk to his children, he responded, "What is there to tell? We stayed behind, we were captured, we spent 5 years in Germany, and then we came home." He saw no heroism in being captured. This humility, this reluctance to claim heroic status, is quintessentially British. However, it also meant that their story was never fully told. The veterans did not tell it. Historians focused their attention on the evacuation, not on the rearguard. Filmmakers produced movies about small boats, not about prisoner of war camps. The film Dunkirk from 2017, with its brilliant cinematography, effectively captures the suspense of the evacuation. It does mention the rearguard, but only in a single scene. A French soldier remarks that French troops are holding the perimeter. A British soldier's face registers guilt. That is the extent of it. A mere 2 seconds of acknowledgement. The rearguard was relegated to a footnote, a detail for dedicated military historians, rather than the central focus of the narrative. However, this presents a significant problem. By erasing the rearguard from the Dunkirk narrative, we also erase the full measure of the miracle's cost. We are left with an inspiring story of civilian vessels and rescued soldiers, but we lose the narrative of the 40,000 men who watched those boats depart without them. And we forfeit the valuable lesson about sacrifice, a sacrifice that does not conform to Hollywood's portrayal. Because the rearguard's sacrifice was not glorious, it was administrative, it was mathematical. It involved 40,000 men accepting 5 years of captivity to grant others a chance to win the war. This was the sacrifice that enabled Britain's survival in 1940, not solely the evacuation, but the unwavering willingness to remain behind. And the Germans understood this. Even if the British narrative chooses not to emphasize it, German military historians consistently highlight the rearguard as the pivotal element in the success of the evacuation. General Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, commander of Army Group A during the campaign, wrote in his post-war analysis, "The British evacuation succeeded because the rearguard fought with a determination that was unexpected from troops awaiting certain capture. This reflects a military culture that we had underestimated. They underestimated the British willingness to make sacrifices, to hold their positions with the knowledge that it meant years of captivity, and to maintain their ranks. That, more than weaponry and ammunition, was what secured the perimeter. The collective psychology of 40,000 men who accepted the unacceptable, because by accepting it, they ensured that others would live. And in return, we have repaid them with silence. Oh, there are memorials, modest ones, regimental memorials that bear the inscription Dunkirk Casualties. Commonwealth War Graves Commission records meticulously list the 6,000 who perished in captivity. Museum exhibits often include a paragraph dedicated to the rearguard, but there is no central memorial, no grand monument honoring the 40,000 who stayed, no national commemoration comparable to the celebrations surrounding the Dunkirk evacuation. They safeguarded Britain, and Britain, in turn, has largely forgotten them. This is not born of malice, but of human nature. We tend to remember inspirational stories and overlook those that are uncomfortable. The rearguard's narrative is uncomfortable because it compels us to confront the stark realities of warfare. Sometimes, saving the majority necessitates the sacrifice of a minority. Sometimes, heroism manifests as accepting capture. Sometimes, the greatest courage lies in remaining in place while others flee. These lessons do not fit neatly into 2-hour films or rousing speeches, which is why they are rarely told. However, if you are watching this video, you are now aware. You know about the 40,000. You understand that they held the perimeter so that 338,000 could escape. You know that they endured 5 years in prisoner of war camps, and that 6,000 never returned home, all so that Britain could continue its fight. And you know that their names now appear nowhere in popular consciousness, despite their indispensable role in the survival of the nation they served. This is the silence of history, and it is time we shattered it. So let us return to our starting point. The British captain on May 31st, 1940, standing in a trench, informing his men that they would surrender at 2300 hours. We began with a fundamental question. How does one order men to remain behind, to face death or imprisonment, while their comrades escape? Now, we possess the answer. You do not order them, you trust them. You trust that their innate sense of duty, their regimental pride, and their bond with the men fighting alongside them are stronger than their instinct for self-preservation. You trust that they will perform the calculation, 40,000 in exchange for 338,000, and accept the resulting equation. You trust that properly led British soldiers will willingly sacrifice years of their lives if the mission demands it. And they did. But here lies a more profound transformation that we must internalize. This fundamentally alters our understanding of sacrifice. We have been conditioned to believe that military sacrifice entails charging machine gun nests, shielding others with one's body from grenades, or piloting aircraft into enemy vessels. These are dramatic, instantaneous acts of heroism. The Dunkirk rearguard demonstrates a different form of sacrifice. The deliberate choice of captivity, the act of watching others depart while remaining behind, fighting not for victory, but for delay, and surrendering not out of defeat, but upon mission completion. This is a more arduous form of sacrifice because it requires a conscious awareness of one's choice. One cannot claim to have acted solely on instinct. One cannot assert that adrenaline took over. You have deliberately and consciously chosen to become a prisoner for 5 years so that others might board the rescue vessels. This is not glory. It is geometry. It involves viewing human lives as vectors within a strategic calculation. And it was effective. Britain survived. In 1940, the British Expeditionary Force was preserved. Those 338,000 men formed the nucleus of the forces that would ultimately secure victory. However, this came at a profound price. 40,000 lives, not lost in direct combat, but endured through prolonged detention. Each served 5 years, accumulating 200,000 cumulative years of human experience within prisoner of war camps. Thousands perished from illness and scarcity, with countless more surviving but bearing the indelible marks, both physical and emotional, for the remainder of their days. Was the endeavor justifiable? Inquire of the 338,000 individuals who returned home. Ask their descendants, their grandchildren, all who exist today because a British serviceman embarked on a vessel on June 1st, choosing steadfastness over mere perimeter defense. Consult every citizen of Britain who draws breath because the nation, in 1940, possessed sufficient fortitude to persevere in its struggle. Their answer would invariably be affirmative, unequivocally deeming it worthwhile. Now consider the 6,000 who succumbed in the detention facilities. Speak with the families who endured 5 years of agonizing uncertainty regarding the fate of their husbands, fathers, and brothers. Question the 29,000 survivors who returned home irrevocably altered, haunted, and diminished by their ordeal. Would their voices echo the same sentiment? We may never ascertain their true feelings, for the majority remained silent. Those who did speak framed their experiences through the lens of duty, not personal cost, uttering phrases like, "We held our ground," "We performed our task." There was nothing extraordinary about it. Yet, what the German adversaries comprehended, though perhaps overlooked in British collective recollection, was far more significant. The events at Dunkirk transcended a mere evacuation. They represented a stark demonstration of British soldiers' unwavering reliability in the face of the most arduous mission imaginable. The charge to remain behind, facilitating the escape of others, was executed with resolute conviction. This capacity for selfless sacrifice, this willingness to subordinate personal safety to overarching strategy, was the linchpin that sustained Britain's continued resistance. This was evident not solely at Dunkirk, but throughout the years of 1947 through 1941, a period when Britain stood isolated against Germany, and the specter of defeat loomed large. British forces pressed on, driven by an unwavering belief in their mission that eclipsed any fear of the consequences. The rearguard's actions validated this commitment 40,000 times over. Herein lies the ultimate paradox. The Germans who witnessed this profound sacrifice drew an erroneous conclusion. They perceived British troops as obstinate and unyielding, viewing their command as squandering elite units on futile positions. They believed that their own superior tactical agility and aggressive exploitation of opportunities trumped the British adherence to orders. They were mistaken. The British were not rigid. They were committed. There exists a crucial distinction. Rigidity implies obedience stemming from a lack of initiative, whereas commitment arises from an understanding of the strategic objective and an acceptance of personal sacrifice. The rearguard demonstrated commitment, not rigidity. They grasped that each hour they held their ground translated into saved lives. It was a deliberate choice, made individually by each man, to place the preservation of those lives above their own liberty. This transcends mere adherence to orders. It represents moral reasoning at its zenith. Despite their considerable tactical prowess, the Germans never fully apprehended this intrinsic British strength. They consistently anticipated British forces breaking under pressure, succumbing to panic, or prioritizing self-preservation. From Dunkirk to El Alamein to Normandy, they awaited a logical response, a choice for survival over the mission's demands. This never materialized because the rearguard at Dunkirk had established an enduring precedent. British soldiers would complete their mission, irrespective of the ultimate personal cost. So, where does this leave us? You may have begun this narrative with the impression that Dunkirk was primarily about naval vessels, civilian valor, and the improbable success of an evacuation. Now you understand that Dunkirk was fundamentally about 40,000 men who chose captivity, who maintained a perimeter they knew was destined to collapse, who fought not for victory but for delay, who watched their comrades depart on boats while they remained in their trenches, bound by the imperative of the mission. They preserved Britain, yet Britain's collective memory scarcely acknowledges their sacrifice. But you, at this very moment, comprehend. You know that while their names may be lost to time, their choice remains indelible. You understand that the evacuation triumphed because 40,000 men deemed 338,000 lives a worthy exchange for 5 years of their own. You recognize that sacrifice is not always a glorious spectacle. At times, it is a cold calculation, a deliberate decision to embrace the direst outcome so that others may be spared. And you now know that the next time the Dunkirk spirit is invoked, referencing British fortitude, civilian boats, and the miraculous rescue, you can supply the crucial missing element. 40,000 soldiers intentionally held their ground, enabling everyone else to escape. This is the authentic Dunkirk narrative, the one Hollywood has largely eschewed, a story that transforms inspiration into an almost unbearable weight, only to, with sustained reflection, re-emerge as something more profound and resilient than mere inspiration. We owe profound respect to those who make choices we pray we never face. If this account has reshaped your understanding of sacrifice, please acknowledge it with a like. If you believe these 40,000 men deserve remembrance, share this video. And if you seek further narratives of British military excellence, corroborated by the perspectives of their adversaries, stories that challenge conventional wisdom about the Second World War, subscribe for access to a wealth of overlooked accounts, many of which have been overshadowed by American narratives, or where German soldiers themselves confessed to confronting unexpected British prowess. The rear guard at Dunkirk maintained their positions until there was nothing left to defend. We can preserve their memory. That is the least we can offer them. 40,000 men, 5 years each for lives saved. Do the arithmetic.